Look in the mirror. Go ahead, really look at yourself. The face staring back at you isn't entirely human, not in the way you think anyway. Right now, woven into every cell of your body, there are genes that didn't come from Homo sapiens. They came from another species, a species we're told went extinct 40,000 years ago. But they didn't really disappear, did they? Because part of them is still here, inside you. If you have ancestry outside of Africa, somewhere between 1 and 4% of your DNA came from Neanderthals. That might not sound like much, but your genome contains about 20,000 genes, which means you're carrying between 200 and 800 Neanderthal genes right now. Genes that are affecting your immune system, your skin, your hair, your brain, even your risk for depression and diabetes. You are a hybrid. We all are. And today, we're going to explore exactly what that means. How did Neanderthal DNA get inside modern humans? What is it doing to us? And what does this say about what it means to be human in the first place? Because the answer is far more disturbing and far more fascinating than you ever imagined. And today, we will be breaking it down. For most of history, we thought we were alone, that Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, spread across the world, and became the sole surviving human species. The story we told ourselves was simple. We were special, unique, the pinnacle of evolution. We were the only true humans. But that story started to crack in the 1850s, when workers in a limestone quarry in Germany's Neander Valley discovered some strange bones. A skull that looked human, but wrong. The brow ridges were massive, jutting forward like a shelf. The skull was elongated. The bones were thick and incredibly robust. Scientists debated for decades about what these bones represented. Some thought they were just unusual Homo sapiens. Others believed they were a completely different species. By the early 1900s, the consensus emerged. These were Neanderthals, or Homo neanderthalensis, a distinct human species that lived in Europe and Western Asia. For the next century, Neanderthals were portrayed as brutish, primitive creatures, cavemen in the worst sense of the word, hunched over, dim-witted, barely capable of speech. The popular image was of a creature more ape than human, something our ancestors had rightfully replaced with superior intelligence and technology. But as more fossils were discovered and analyzed, that image began to change. Neanderthals weren't the knuckle-dragging brutes of stereotype. They were sophisticated. They made complex stone tools, some of which required multiple steps and careful planning to create. They controlled fire and built hearths. They hunted large game with wooden spears. They cared for their sick and injured, evidenced by fossils showing healed wounds that would have required months of care to survive. They buried their dead, sometimes with what appear to be grave goods or flowers. They created art, carving symbols into cave walls and crafting jewelry from shells and bones. They may have had language, or something close to it. Recent studies of their hyoid bone, the small bone in the throat that supports the tongue, suggest they were physically capable of speech. Neanderthals had larger brains than modern humans, not just proportionally, but in absolute size. Their average brain volume was about 1,500 cubic centimeters, compared to our 1,400. Now, brain size doesn't directly equal intelligence, but it tells us something important. These were not simple creatures. They were thinking, feeling, complex beings. And they looked surprisingly human. Yes, they were built differently, stockier, more muscular, with shorter limbs adapted to cold climates. But if you dressed a Neanderthal in modern clothes and put them on a subway, would you notice? Maybe, maybe not. They were different, but not alien. Close enough to us that when our ancestors encountered them, something unexpected happened. They didn't just fight, they didn't just compete for resources, they interbred. The first encounter probably happened somewhere in the Middle East around 100,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Homo sapiens had begun to expand out of Africa, following the coastlines and river valleys into new territories. And there, in the Levant region, in what is now Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, they met Neanderthals who had already been living in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. Imagine that moment. You're part of a small band of humans, maybe 20 or 30 individuals, moving through unfamiliar territory. You've traveled for months, maybe years, following herds and seasonal resources. And then, one day, you see them. Figures in the distance, upright, walking on two legs, using fire, making tools. They look almost like your people, but something's off. They're built differently. Their faces are different. Their speech, if they have it, sounds strange. Are they human? Are they something else? Your instinct might be to fear them, to see them as competitors or threats. But they're also intriguing. They clearly survive in this environment. They know things you don't. And despite the differences, they're recognizably similar to you. What happened next is the uncomfortable part, because interbreeding requires, well, breeding. And we need to be honest about what that probably looked like. In some cases, it might have been consensual, or at least as consensual as anything could be in the brutal world of the Paleolithic. Perhaps there were long-term relationships, even something resembling partnerships. There's evidence that at least some Neanderthals and Homo sapiens lived in close proximity for extended periods of time. They shared the same caves, used the same tools, hunted the same animals. But let's not romanticize it too much. In other cases, the encounters were probably violent. Raids, abductions, assaults. This was a world without law, without any formal social structure beyond the immediate group. Violence between groups was common, and when different groups of Homo sapiens encountered each other, violence often resulted. So why would encounters with Neanderthals be any different? The archaeological record hints at both possibilities. Some Neanderthal sites show evidence of peaceful coexistence with modern humans. Others show signs of violent conflict. The truth is, probably that it varied, depending on the circumstances, the individuals involved, and pure chance. But regardless of how it happened, the result was the same. Hybrid children were born. Children who carried genes from both species, and crucially, at least some of those children survived, grew up, and had children of their own. Because if they hadn't, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Their genes wouldn't be inside you. For decades, this was just speculation. We knew Neanderthals and Homo sapiens had overlapped in time and space. We had fossils from the same regions and periods. But did they actually interbreed? Many scientists were skeptical. After all, we're talking about different species. And while different species can sometimes produce offspring, like horses and donkeys producing mules, those offspring are usually sterile. They can't pass on their genes. So even if Neanderthals and Homo sapiens had mated and produced hybrid children, many scientists assumed those hybrids would have been evolutionary dead ends, sterile or unhealthy, not capable of contributing to the gene pool. Then came 2010, and everything changed. A team led by Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo published a paper in the journal Science that would revolutionize our understanding of human evolution. They had done something that seemed impossible. They had sequenced the Neanderthal genome. This was a monumental achievement. DNA degrades over time, especially in bones that have been buried for tens of thousands of years. The fragments they were working with were tiny, contaminated with modern DNA, and incredibly difficult to piece together. But using cutting-edge techniques, Pääbo's team managed to reconstruct large portions of the Neanderthal genetic code. And when they compared that code to modern human genomes, they found something shocking. Neanderthal DNA sequences showed up in modern humans. Not in all humans, but specifically in people with ancestry outside of Africa. Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, people from Oceania all carried Neanderthal markers. But people with purely sub-Saharan African ancestry didn't. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Sometime after Homo sapiens left Africa and before they spread across the rest of the world, they interbred with Neanderthals. And the hybrid children from those unions were viable, fertile, and successful enough to pass on Neanderthal genes to all of their descendants. You are one of those descendants. The amount varies from person to person. On average, people of European descent carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA. People of East Asian descent carry slightly more, around 2.5%. Some individuals have been found with as much as 4 or 5%. A few people, mostly those with recent African ancestry, have close to 0. Now, 2% might not sound like much, but think about what that actually means. Your genome contains about 3 billion base pairs, the individual chemical units that make up your DNA. 2% of 3 billion is 60 million base pairs. That's 60 million positions in your genetic code where you have the Neanderthal version of the sequence instead of the Homo sapiens version. And those differences matter because genes are instructions. They tell your cells how to build proteins, how to respond to the environment, how to function. Change the instructions, even slightly, and you change the outcome. So, what are these Neanderthal genes actually doing to you? Let's start with your immune system. This is where some of the most important Neanderthal contributions show up. When Homo sapiens left Africa and moved into Eurasia, they encountered a completely new disease environment. Different bacteria, different viruses, different parasites. These were pathogens that Neanderthals had been dealing with for hundreds of thousands of years. They had evolved resistance. We hadn't. But when interbreeding happened, some of those Neanderthal immune genes got passed to hybrid offspring. And because those genes provided a survival advantage, they were favored by natural selection. Today, about 50% of the variation in immune system genes called HLA genes in modern Eurasians comes from Neanderthals and Denisovans, another archaic human species we'll talk about shortly. These genes help your immune system recognize and fight off pathogens. They're the reason you can survive infections that might have killed your ancestors. In a very real sense, Neanderthal DNA helped modern humans survive in Eurasia. But there's a cost, because those same immune genes that protect you from infections can also make you more prone to allergies and autoimmune diseases. When your immune system is hyperactive, it sometimes attacks things it shouldn't. Your own tissues, pollen, harmless foods. Studies have linked certain Neanderthal gene variants to increased risk of allergies, asthma, and hay fever. It's a trade-off. Better protection against deadly diseases, but more sensitivity to irritants. Now, let's talk about your skin and hair. If you have fair skin, red hair, or certain skin conditions, you might have Neanderthals to thank, or blame. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia for at least 300,000 years before modern humans arrived. These are high-latitude regions with less sunlight than Africa. And sunlight is crucial for producing vitamin D in the skin, so Neanderthals, like modern Europeans, evolved lighter skin to maximize vitamin D production in low-light environments. When modern humans moved into these same regions, they faced the same challenge, and interbreeding with Neanderthals gave them a shortcut. Instead of waiting thousands of generations for light skin to evolve through random mutation and selection, they just borrowed the genes from Neanderthals who already had them. Studies have identified specific Neanderthal genes that affect skin and hair color in modern Europeans. Some of these genes are associated with pale skin, others with red hair. If you're a fair-skinned, red-haired person of European descent, there's a good chance you owe those traits, at least in part, to your Neanderthal ancestors. But again, there's a downside. Those same gene variants are also associated with increased risk of skin conditions and sun sensitivity. Fair skin burns more easily. Some Neanderthal gene variants have been linked to higher risk of certain types of skin lesions when exposed to sunlight. Then there's your brain. This is where things get really complicated and really controversial. Neanderthals had large brains. We know this from their skulls. But did they think differently than Homo sapiens? Did they have different cognitive abilities, different personalities, different mental health profiles? We can't know for sure, but we can look at the genes involved in brain development and function and see which Neanderthal variants show up in modern humans. Several studies have found associations between Neanderthal genes and neurological traits. Some Neanderthal gene variants are more common in people who report feeling depressed or lonely. Others are associated with different sleep patterns, particularly being more of an evening person or morning person. Some are linked to smoking behavior, though it's unclear if this is a direct effect or related to other traits like risk-taking or addiction susceptibility. One of the most studied Neanderthal genes is FOXP2, often called the language gene. This gene is crucial for speech and language development. The modern human version of FOXP2 is slightly different from the chimpanzee version, and those differences are thought to be part of what gives us our advanced language abilities. But here's the interesting part. Neanderthals had the same FOXP2 mutations as modern humans. This suggests they were capable of speech, or at least had the genetic machinery for it. And when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred, those genes were already compatible. We were speaking the same genetic language, so to speak. Now, let's talk about the dark side, because not all Neanderthal genes are helpful. Some actively harm your health. Studies have linked Neanderthal gene variants to increased risk of type 2 diabetes. The theory is that these genes helped Neanderthals survive in cold climates by efficiently storing fat for insulation and energy reserves. But in modern environments with abundant food and less physical activity, those same fat storage genes contribute to obesity and metabolic disease. Other Neanderthal variants are associated with increased risk of depression, particularly seasonal affective disorder. Again, this might have been adaptive in Ice Age Europe, where seasonal changes were extreme, but in modern life, it's a liability. Some Neanderthal genes affect blood clotting. They make your blood more likely to form clots, which can increase risk of stroke and heart disease. Why would natural selection favor genes that increase clotting? Probably because in the dangerous Paleolithic world, quick clotting meant you were less likely to bleed to death from injuries. But in modern sedentary life, it means more risk of cardiovascular problems. And then there's COVID-19. In 2020, researchers discovered that a cluster of genes on chromosome 3 inherited from Neanderthals significantly increases risk of severe COVID-19. People who carry 2 copies of this gene variant are 3 times more likely to require hospitalization if infected. This gene variant is particularly common in people of South Asian descent. Around 50% carry at least 1 copy, and less common in Europeans. So, Neanderthal genes that might have protected against ancient pathogens are now making some of us more vulnerable to a modern virus. Evolution doesn't plan ahead. It optimizes for the environment you're in, not the environment you'll face 50,000 years later. But Neanderthals weren't the only archaic humans we interbred with. There's another species in your DNA, one that's even more mysterious. In 2010, the same year the Neanderthal genome was published, Svante Pääbo's team announced another discovery. In a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a place called Denisova Cave, they had found a tiny finger bone and a tooth. The DNA from these fragments revealed a previously unknown human species, now called Denisovans. We still don't have a complete skeleton of a Denisovan. We don't really know what they looked like. But we have their DNA, and that DNA shows up in modern humans, particularly in people from Oceania and Southeast Asia. Indigenous Australians, Papua New Guineans, and some Filipino populations carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. That's even more than the Neanderthal DNA in Europeans. And some of those Denisovan genes are doing remarkable things. One of the most famous examples is a gene called EPAS1 found in Tibetan populations. This gene helps the body adapt to high altitude by regulating red blood cell production and oxygen uptake. Tibetans who carry the Denisovan version of this gene don't suffer from altitude sickness the way most people would at 15,000 feet. They can live and thrive on the high plateau because of a gene borrowed from an extinct human species. Another Denisovan gene, found in Inuit populations, helps with cold adaptation and fat metabolism. It's the same story. Archaic humans who had adapted to extreme environments passed on their adaptations to modern humans when interbreeding occurred. And it wasn't just Neanderthals and Denisovans. There's growing evidence of at least one, possibly several, additional archaic human species in Africa that contributed DNA to modern African populations. These are ghost lineages, species we haven't found fossils of yet, but can detect through their genetic signatures. DNA analysis of modern West Africans reveals segments of DNA that don't match any known human lineage. They're too different from Homo sapiens to have arisen through normal variation, but they're clearly human. The most likely explanation is that, as Homo sapiens spread through Africa, they encountered and interbred with other archaic human populations that had been isolated for hundreds of thousands of years. So, the picture that emerges is not of a single human species, but of a complex web of different human populations, meeting, mixing, and exchanging genes across hundreds of thousands of years. We are not pure anything. We are an amalgamation, a blend of multiple lineages. Now, here's a question that might be bothering you. If we're all hybrids, why did Neanderthals go extinct? If interbreeding was happening, if hybrid children were viable and successful, why aren't Neanderthals still around? The answer is complicated. Neanderthals didn't go extinct in the traditional sense, where an entire species is wiped out. Instead, they were absorbed, assimilated. Their population was always small, probably never more than a few tens of thousands of individuals spread across a huge geographic area. When Homo sapiens arrived with larger population numbers, Neanderthals didn't disappear through genocide or competition alone. They disappeared through integration. Each generation, a few more Neanderthals had children with Homo sapiens. Each generation, the hybrid offspring, were slightly more sapiens and slightly less Neanderthal. Over thousands of years, the distinct Neanderthal population dissolved into the much larger Homo sapiens gene pool. It's a slower, more subtle form of extinction, but the result is the same. There are no full-blooded Neanderthals left, but their genes live on in billions of people. Some scientists have argued that we should rethink our classification system entirely. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens could interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring, were they really separate species? In biology, one definition of a species is a group that can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. By that definition, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were the same species. Others point out that just because interbreeding is possible doesn't mean it's common or easy. Lions and tigers can interbreed in captivity, producing ligers and tigons, but they're still considered separate species because they don't naturally interbreed in the wild. Similarly, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were different enough, behaviorally and geographically, that they remained distinct populations for most of their existence. The interbreeding only happened in specific times and places. The debate continues, but what's clear is that the boundaries we draw between species are often arbitrary and fuzzy, especially when we're talking about closely related populations. So what does all this mean for you, personally? How should you think about the Neanderthal DNA inside you? First, you can actually find out how much you have. Companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and others offer genetic testing that will tell you your approximate Neanderthal percentage. They compare your genome to reference sequences and calculate what proportion of your DNA matches Neanderthal variants. Most people are somewhere in the 2 to 3% range, but there's variation. If you're on the high end, 4 to 5%, it doesn't mean you're more primitive or less evolved. It just means you happen to inherit more of the Neanderthal segments that have persisted through 50,000 years of human reproduction. Second, you can look at which specific Neanderthal genes you carry and what they do. Some testing companies provide reports on specific traits associated with Neanderthal variants. Do you have the Neanderthal gene for straight hair? The one associated with height? The one linked to preferring evening activities over morning ones? It's important not to overinterpret this. Having a Neanderthal gene variant associated with a trait doesn't mean that's the reason you have that trait. Genetics is complex. Most traits are influenced by hundreds or thousands of genes, plus environmental factors. Your red hair might be partly due to Neanderthal genes, but it's also due to many other genes and the fact that your ancestors lived in low sunlight environments. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this should change how you think about human identity. The story we tell about humanity is often one of exceptionalism. We're special, unique, separate from the rest of the animal kingdom, and even from other humans. But the DNA evidence tells a different story. We are not separate. We are connected to other human species through the most intimate possible connection: shared ancestry, shared genes, shared identity. The Neanderthals didn't disappear. They became us. This has philosophical implications. If we carry Neanderthal genes, if those genes are functional and important, then Neanderthals are not truly extinct. Part of them lives on. In a very real sense, when you look in the mirror, you're looking at a Neanderthal descendant. It also raises questions about how we define humanity. For centuries, we drew a bright line between Homo sapiens and everyone else. We were human, they were not. But if we're carrying their DNA, if we're benefiting from their adaptations, if we exist because they contributed to our gene pool, then maybe that line was never as clear as we thought. Some researchers have started using the term archaic human instead of Neanderthal or Denisovan. It's a way of acknowledging that these were human, just different versions of human than us. And through interbreeding, we are now carrying forward the legacy of multiple human lineages. There's also an ethical dimension. As we develop technologies like CRISPR that allow us to edit genes, we'll have to make decisions about which genes to keep and which to modify. If someone has a Neanderthal gene variant that increases their risk of disease, should we edit it out? Or is that gene part of their heritage? Something worth preserving? What about bringing back Neanderthal genes that have been lost? We know there are Neanderthal gene variants that existed in ancient hybrids but have since disappeared from the modern gene pool, eliminated by natural selection or random chance. If we can identify those genes, should we reintroduce them? Could we, theoretically, reconstruct a more Neanderthal-like human? These aren't just science fiction questions anymore. The technology exists or is rapidly approaching, and the answers will depend on how we think about identity, diversity, and what it means to be human. Let me give you one more mind-bending fact. In 2018, researchers announced the discovery of a bone fragment from Denisova Cave that belonged to a teenage girl who lived about 90,000 years ago. When they analyzed her DNA, they found something extraordinary. Her mother was Neanderthal, and her father was Denisovan. She was a first-generation hybrid between two different archaic human species. Think about what that means. Her parents were from different species, as different from each other as Neanderthals were from Homo sapiens, and yet they met, they mated, and they produced a viable daughter who lived at least into her early teens. This tells us that interbreeding between human lineages wasn't a rare one-time fluke. It was happening regularly enough that we can find direct evidence of it in the fossil record. These different human populations were interacting, mixing, and producing hybrid offspring as a matter of course. And here's the really wild part. That girl's genome has been sequenced. We can read her DNA. We can see exactly which chromosomes came from her mother and which from her father. We can trace the specific genetic contributions of two extinct human species combined in one individual 90,000 years ago. She is, in a sense, an ancestor of yours. Not directly, probably, but part of the same web of relationships that produced modern humans. Her existence proves that the boundaries between human lineages were permeable, that love or lust or circumstance could bridge the gap between species. So where does this leave us? What's the takeaway from all this? I think it's this. You are more than you think you are. Your identity, your biology, your very existence is the result of thousands of generations of humans meeting, mixing, surviving, and adapting. You are not just Homo Sapiens. You are the inheritor of multiple human lineages, each contributing something unique. The Neanderthal genes in your cells helped your ancestors survive Ice Age Europe. They protect you from diseases. They influence how you look, how you think, how you experience the world. They are not foreign or other. They are you. And this is true for all of us. We are all hybrids, all blends, all carrying the legacy of multiple human species. There is no pure human, no original form we've deviated from. We are, and have always been, mixed. In a time when people are obsessed with ancestry, with finding out where they come from and who their people are, maybe this is the most important lesson. Your people aren't just one group, one population, one species. Your people are all of humanity, across time and space, including the ones we used to think were separate from us. The Neanderthals are not them. They are us. Their DNA flows through your veins. Their adaptations help you survive. Their story is your story. So the next time you look in the mirror, remember, you're looking at something rare and precious, a hybrid of multiple human lineages shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, carrying genes from species that walked the earth long before modern civilization existed. You are a living fossil, a bridge between the past and the future, a testament to the fact that humans have always found ways to connect, to mix, to survive together. And that, more than any single gene or trait, might be the most important thing your Neanderthal ancestors gave you, the proof that we are all one family, no matter how different we might seem. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the DNA you didn't know you had, hit that like button. Drop a comment below telling me what your Neanderthal percentage is if you've had your DNA tested, or what trait you think might come from your archaic ancestors. And if you haven't tested your DNA yet, are you curious now? Let me know. Don't forget to subscribe to keep getting stories like this, stories about who we are, where we came from, and what makes us human. And if you want more, check out my video on how Neanderthals actually lived and what their world was like. You might be surprised by how sophisticated they really were. I'll see you in the next one.